in the sense the body itself is a
Mm.
unit of time. So what do you do with that? I mean, religious communities have better ways of describing that feeling of revelation. I mean, what the body really is glory. So as a woman, to have such an understanding, it's like, well, okay, go on, pour your glory into a pair of Spanx.
Mm.
See how that works for you. Go take your glory for a walk and go have a coffee with a friend, because you can't live every moment of your life in existential awe.
Mm.
It makes you weird. You still have to care about your small, and you understand exactly how small it is, life in this world, and talk about things. But you hold on to that. You can't help but understand always at the same time what your body is, something that is profoundly ancient. And that while your body will cease, the continuation of the universe very much goes on.
Hey, Kat,
Hi, good morning.
where are you sitting? What are you looking at?
Well, I'm looking at your face, Frank.
Okay, I know
I
that.
am looking at a computer monitor, and I'm looking at the wall of my office, which has just recently been turned back into an office after years of it being a baby room. I'm a woman living a life. Yeah.
Where are you living?
Seattle.
Okay, so you're in Seattle. Well, I'm in Massachusetts watching a nice big snowstorm come down. I live about 30 miles north of Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been in this house for the last, 43 years. So I guess you could say I'm settled. And I have 3 of my grandchildren living across the street, 3 of 5 grandchildren living across the street, for whom the oldest is 15. So Jeannie and I, my wife and I, have been doing childcare for them for the last 15 years, which has been nice because they can walk to our house.
That is a beautiful thing. That is a beautiful thing.
And let's see, this last weekend, their parents went off cross-country skiing. And so we had the 3 of them, 15, 13, and 9, in the house for 3 nights. It was lovely.
Oh, lovely.
Cooked up a storm for them, read to them,
Mm.
played a lot of cards on Jeannie's bed, and had a really good time. Hey, I have
Sounds like a very nice nesting.
Yes, good nesting. And, in the winter, particularly next to the wood-fired stove in the kitchen. So we do that. Hey, I'm going to introduce you here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. This is a podcast and a Facebook Live event that then goes where all podcasts and YouTube-y things go. And today I'm talking with Cat Bohannon, who is the author of this book. And this book is Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. Usually when I introduce a book, Cat, I don't also mention that I bought 5 hard copies of this book for Christmas presents and handed them out to children and grandchildren, and in my living room on Christmas Day, having read it myself in hard copy, gone through Kindle to pull quotes from, and then, in addition to which, have joined my wife, Jeannie, in listening to you read it very beautifully, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
In your, whatever it is. I mean, I'm old enough to call it books on tape, but it's not. It's
I think they call it an audiobook now.
there it is, audiobooks. And
it's what they called it back then too, but my dad also would listen to many, many books on tape driving in the car with the old cassette players. You slot them in.
There we go.
And of course, back then, it's like 12 cassettes. It's like a big production to have a whole book on tape. Nowadays, it's just a file.
And then you'd send them back.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that a lot because my oldest son, who's now a remarkable teacher, was pretty dyslexic when he was a kid. And we were lucky that, unlike me, who did not get diagnosed, he was diagnosed and helped. But we had a service, interestingly enough, to get him into reading that was provided in those days, again on cassette tape, from a group that catered to blind people.
Oh, that makes sense.
This is pre everything. And we would get these things, he'd listen, and then we'd send them back, and so forth and so on. So let me introduce you a little more properly. Kat is a PhD from Columbia University, where she studied evolution of narrative and cognition, and her writings appeared in Scientific American, Science Magazine, et cetera, et cetera. And she has written this book, again, I'm going to talk about it, Eve, the Female Body, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Evolution. Only 2 books I've written and read in the last 10 or 15 years have actually changed the way I see the world and myself. And Kat's book is one of them. It's a kind of a before and after book. The other, by the way, is on a related subject by another woman author, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, who wrote a book called The Old Way, A Story of the First People, where she lived in the 1950s in the Kalahari with the Sand People, who you actually mentioned in your book as something you talk about. But on a personal note, let me just start by saying this. I have been in love with Jeannie since I got her pregnant when we were 17 and 18. And I love Jeannie passionately, but having read your book, it's as if Jeannie is a loved country and you're the first person who provided me with a map. And I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. From the bottom of my heart. You can't believe what a relief it has been to me. I was raised in an evangelical fundamentalist Christian. We knew nothing about evolution. Evolution was the enemy. And I've done a lot of reading since and discovered many things. And I guess for a layperson, I'm pretty well read on the subject, but your book had a completely different tone to it. It was a revelation to me. And I've never read something that has so changed the way I think about things. So I'm going to give you one example and then let you riff on that. You're the only person I've read who has dramatically pointed out to me in many, many ways through a book on evolution, in this case about women, females, all these Eves you have going through the book, the sheer incompetence of evolution and the kind of haphazard nature. I'd never thought of that before. You know, having grown up as an evangelical Christian, you always picture God as perfect. So therefore the creation must have been the way it's supposed to be until we fell and fucked it all up. You come along and say, no. When we stood upright, it did all sorts of things to our internal organs. If you're wondering why we have 3 orifices instead of 1 and what that did, when the urinary tract kicks in, it changes everything. And if you the placenta, here it is, and it sort of devours the human female during pregnancy, and on and on and on, late additions to evolution that happen after we stand upright and so forth. So let me just start with that. Why, where did this click for you that evolution itself is a kind of not incompetence, the wrong word, but touch and go process that has left us carrying the short end of the stick in so many ways, whether it's, in childbirth or the difficulty that women have in certain ways with their bodies, and men too, by extension. But I just thought that was a remarkable, never seen it before theme in your book. So take it away. Let's talk about that for a start.
Oh, that's big and that's meaty. Though I am an atheist, I certainly wasn't always. My mother still is a card-carrying Irish Catholic American, still sings in the choir, but she's like a cafeteria Catholic, right? She, at this point, like a lot of New York people, she keeps what she wants, and then the other part, she's like, I'm not really sure, but she still sings in the choir, And when I was 8, I was practically a holy roller. I was carrying around a little vial of holy water and sprinkling around the corners of the room. I was very distraught when it did not keep my hamster who'd fallen sick alive. And I wasn't really sure what to do about that. Or when my hamster was pregnant and then started eating her babies. And I was like, this doesn't seem, I'm not sure. Well, okay, fine. Anyway, it took quite a while for me, probably early teens, to find my way into the atheism that I have. But the thing that I never quite let go of, I would say, is that I think revelation's the right word, and I heard you use it, and that's an old word that's meant many things for you, I assume. Yeah. Over time, there's that feeling of how do I say it? It's like a revelation. In some ways, the scientific communities have very, very similar feelings when we are exposed to certain ideas or truths about the universe, but we don't have as good a set of language to describe the feeling. Yeah. And I think actually religious communities might have it a little better. So for example, I've now thought for a very long time about deep time. and the absolute catastrophe and haphazardness, and how funny it is, of course, that we ended up with these weird bodies that
Mm.
are the way that they are. But as soon as you start thinking about deep time for any amount of time, it does change you,
Mm.
because it changes your understanding of where you are in the world, and it changes your understanding of what you are and what the world is. And because what it is inevitably is parting the veil a little bit and letting you get a peek at the kind of shining gearworks of the universe,
Mm.
the actual mechanisms that drive reality, that make us what we are and where we come from. So that means now when I look in the mirror, as any of us who've spent time thinking about evolution do, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? Well, first you see all of your anxieties, especially if you're female, and it takes quite a while, depending how much therapy you've had, to kind of work through all that, because that's kind of your anxieties and a rough silhouette of a person, and there's the mirror, especially as we get older. But what else you inevitably see then, once you've thought about deep time, is you understand that the body isn't so much a thing that is as a thing that is happening. And so that means that it's really more like you are a point in a stream of light that's cascading out backwards from you and pushing out forwards from you, in the sense the body itself is a unit of time. So what do you do with that? I mean, religious communities have better ways of describing that feeling of revelation. I mean, what the body really is glory. So as a woman, to have such an understanding, it's like, well, okay, go on, pour your glory into a pair of Spanx. See how that works for you. Take your glory for a walk and go have a coffee with a friend, because you can't live every moment of your life in existential awe. It makes you weird. You still have to care about your small, and you understand exactly how small it is, life in this world, and talk about things. But you hold on to that. You can't help but understand always at the same time what your body is something that is profoundly ancient. And that while your body will cease, the continuation of the universe very much goes on. So that changes you.
Yeah, one thing I really got from your book that was so great is something that I always say about writing when people ask me about my books, and I've written novels and memoirs and all kinds of things, some of which have been bestsellers and others have sunk like a stone, never to be seen again. But the point I'm trying to make is when people ask me, what did you mean on page such and such of such and such a book? I have to explain, look, that was a snapshot of where I was that day.
Yeah.
And you do the same thing for evolution. It's as if when your book finishes, the chapters are continuing to be written. Just one thing that blew my mind, it's so basic. And again, somehow either I had missed it in my reading, or had not had it communicated to me, but just this one point of this huge transition between the female laying her eggs outside of her body and the female, as it were, gestating her eggs within her body, and the huge mess this creates and the huge complication. And then, I kind of finished the book saying, wow, I'd like to come back in, whatever, 500,000 years, 1.5 million years, and see whether there's been another step here. And I'm not talking about high-tech intervention. I mean, evolutionary step. Again, just as the kind of incompetence and the touch and go, hit and miss nature of evolution so strongly represented in your book in a way that, I don't know, it's just humbling as a human. We are these sort of creatures of time. But then this kind of process of an unfinished work in the human body that continues. There are ragged edges, there's unanswered questions. And I love this snapshot in time. Just talk a little bit about that aspect of your work and how that informed it, because it's so present all through the book. And all the way, all the little Eves, huddled in a hole somewhere with dinosaurs tromping around on them. And you're talking about this little creature feeling love somehow when she's producing milk that's being sucked off her chest before their nipples, this kind of thing. Boom. My head just boom. I love it. I love the book. I love your writing. But talk a little bit about the snapshot in time aspect of the continuing story.
Yeah. So on the one hand, I set myself out the task of writing the story, essentially, of, well, every woman everywhere ever, because I clearly lack ambition and arrogance. But it's inevitably true that we are each, all of us, the product of this deep evolution. And it's sort of like, well, well, how we tell the story of ourselves matters, you know what I
Hmm.
mean? And in an evolutionary story, it's never just, it's not a hero's tale. It's not just
Hmm.
one of us. It's very much billions of us, and us really deforming by what we mean by us
Yeah.
the further back in time you even go. So 200 million years is an almost incomprehensible amount of time, but we do know a lot about that moment. We do know the origin of mammals to a degree, or
Hmm.
at least we know these little snapshots of the story. We know at some point we started lactating, we started breastfeeding well before there were breasts, well before there
Hmm.
were nipples. We just had these like sweaty milk patches that came out through our fur, which, by the way, the monotremes still have that. No nipples there on the duck-billed platypus. Just
Yeah, I
like a
love that.
sweaty little, like her milk is coming out through these mammary patches of hairs on her
Hmm.
belly, and she's still laying eggs, much like ancient mammals do. You remember, your audience, I don't know, the duck-billed platypus looks like a duck, but also has webbed feet and it has fur,
Yeah.
and apparently it's a mammal. When they first discovered it, they thought they'd made it up. You know, like it's a crazy, crazy animal, still very
Yeah.
much
People
alive,
coming back
thought
from
to
Australia
represent a
with,
lot of our,
yeah.
yeah, exactly, a lot of our, what ancient mammals were like. And so they hatch out of eggs, as in
Mhm.
she lays the eggs externally. Actually, the duck-billed platypus lays them directly onto her tail, which she's curled onto her body, like kind of like a damp burrito, like a
Mm.
J shape. And then she lays them right on her tail, and then they hatch, and then they start slurping fur out of her tummy, right? So this is the idea of where breastfeeding comes from. And of
Hmm.
course, having been raised Catholic, you know, my great image of one of the origin stories is the Madonna, you know, the Madonna
Sure.
and child, nursing the child. There's this big religious iconography that goes on forever. You know, well, not forever, actually, just a few thousand years, which turns out is a very small window of time.
Very short time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I had my illustrator do all of the eaves. Now, just to clarify, the eaves are a last common ancestor for each of these traits,
And by the
right?
way, the illustrations are lovely
She
and
did
they're
an amazing
beautiful.
job, didn't
So
she?
many compliments to the illustrator because
She's so
I just
talented.
love them. I love them.
Hmm. Hmm.
I hope you wound up with a couple of the originals to hang on your
I
wall because
did. I
they're
did. I did.
gorgeous.
And I love them so, so, so
Yeah, I'll
much.
find one. They're all at the chapter heads, and I keep talking while I
Mhm.
flip through and get one.
Yeah, my editor, Andrew at Knopf, he and I were like, oh, I wish we had some portraits of Eves. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm just going
Yeah, for
to,
instance, here's one here.
oh,
This
yeah, for
portrait.
voice there. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's an early Homo sapien. So the last three chapters of the book have Homo sapien
Yeah, and
illustrators.
before that, we have illustrations of the other Eves.
Yeah, but
I
what's
hadn't
so,
prepared to do this.
oh,
Here's,
you don't have to worry about it. I mean, if
oh,
you
no,
want
no,
to,
I
that's
love
fine.
them. I'm going to
But
do it.
what
You
I
keep
love about
talking.
them, and it sounds, one of the things she had wanted to do, because my
Here we
illustrator was
are.
also
Here's an
raised
early
Catholic.
Eve.
There we go. There, that is Purgatorius, one of the first primates, and she's amazing. And we rendered it like a saint card, like an old Catholic saint card. But
Yeah, I
instead
love
of the
them.
saints, of course, we had these many Eves, who are the
Yeah.
last common ancestors of these traits. And we used some of the botanical features, you know, some of the plants that lived during that era that we knew from
Yeah, and by
paleo.
the way, my producer Ernie tells me just before we do this, he says, "I know you're going to call Cat Eve all through this show. Would you please not call her Eve?" Because so
It
I've
is right on the
absorbed
cover.
your,
It's true.
hey, you are an Eve. You're part of the evolutionary process.
Well, technically, so are you, because you know, we do this useful thing of the sex differentiation as a concept, right?
Yeah,
But by an Eve, I simply mean an originating ancestor,
yeah.
you know, living in a population
Well, I
in
have marks of
slice
some
of
of
time.
the female Eves too, because as you point
Yes.
out in the book, one of your amusing little details was that the reason I have nipples, as far as you could tell,
Hmm.
was that because evolution had done so much work and spent so much energy giving women nipples they actually need to breastfeed, having gone through this whole process, that it was like, why change the design for the guys? We've invented this thing. Everybody, you know, why do all the work to take them off? So I finally understood why I have nipples. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. Yeah, you do have them because you are a mammal. It's just
Yes, I'm a
that.
mammal,
It's because you're a mammal.
but the big work had been done for the female, and mine are
Yes.
just sort of, oh well, we already, that's the basic design. We're going to leave, you know, we're going to leave them on this kind of useless inseminator, even though he has no use for them.
Well, I don't really think of males as useless inseminators, actually. It's just more that your story had been so thoroughly told, it seemed worthwhile to tell the other half.
Well, and you
More
start out
like
the
that.
book talking about all the research that goes into men's, you know,
Yeah.
problems and medical things, and you know, it's about time we look at women as their own thing, which I think is so apt and true, but I interrupted you. You were
No,
talking
no.
about our various Eves. Let me pause here and just say that I'm talking to Cat Bohannon, who is the author of Eve and How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution. So, okay, next thing I need to do here is say, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, which is where I make my commentaries at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And lastly, and most important here, Eve, this book is the first book of my new It Has to Be Said book club that we have picked, because there are some books that we review and do that we want to do more about than simply talk to the author. We want to continuously promote, and the book club is one of the ways. We're lucky that we have about 350,000 followers, and I'm hoping some of them buy this book. And we want to really push it. So it's the first in our book club, Kat. So thank you for providing that. Now, back to the conversation.
Well, I am flattered and honored. Thank you so much. One of the things I've found so I thought it might be true, but I wasn't sure. But it was so beautiful about this process of putting the book out in the world, which is a very different process from writing it. I was, like in my little cave with all of the scientific databases and occasionally sending emails and just typey for actual years and years and years while I was doing my PhD on a mostly unrelated topics. So I was very much in a cave. And then I've come out into the world, and now Eve is out in the world, and it's a whole other thing, and being on the TV and learning how to do that, all of that, right?
Well,
but what's been beautiful is how many conversations, and you opened by talking about you and your wife. I mean, how many little conversations about our bodies we're getting to have as this book's been out in the world. It really seems to open this door where we have permission to talk about the female body in a way. It's like, I don't know, that thing where you break a taboo and it's like, well, she already did. Now we can just walk through the door, that thing. It's been
I have a question
really
for you
beautiful.
apropos of that and yourself. And that is, in reading the book, I used to direct movies before I became a writer, and I made 4 very forgettable Hollywood feature films and about 20 or 30 hours of documentaries before that. But one of the side effects of having been a movie maker is that it takes a really great film for me to forget that I know, I've looked behind the curtain. I know what's going on. I'm wondering, in your own life, and I know this is a dramatic change of subject, but obviously it took you a long time to write this book. And you have been, as it were, dissecting your own body again and again and again by writing this incredible history of the female form. And I'm wondering if that has in any way changed the way you see yourself, your relationships, your role as a woman, quote unquote. I hate that word, those words. I don't know how to say it otherwise. Your parenthood, because you talk about your own children, sex, lovemaking, your relationship with the man in your life. You've written so deeply about the evolution of all these things. Small example, I was relieved to hear that because my penis is not corkscrew shaped, that my great ancestors were not all rapists, because otherwise we would have much more complicated human vaginas and penises, because this is what ducks and rhinoceroses do to fend off unwanted rapey ancestors. Nice little thing that jumped out of the book. But what I'm trying to say is if it's made me more conscious of Jeannie, a woman I've been with all these years, and my daughters and granddaughters, and how I look at people, I'm just imagining from the author's point of view, you have been looking at yourself. How has that actually changed, if at all, the way you see yourself as a female of the species?
Oh man, in so many ways, it's sort of hard to know where to start. But I can tell you, in the process of writing it, I sort of forced myself to be open to what I would discover, and kept resolving internally to remain kind of emotionally vulnerable to the process, when many times I would rather not, because that is part of the writing of the thing, which is very different from my academic writing. Of course, in my academic writing, I'm simply presenting the facts as they lie and making my arguments and so on and so forth. But this was a different sort of book. This is a book that required me to remain rather naked, as it were, metaphorically on any given page. So yeah, I will tell you that I got a little bit superstitious through the process, and I'm not normally, that whole atheist thing, For example, I didn't do all the chapters in order, right? And so when I was working on the womb chapter, which is earlier on, live birth comes after breastfeeding, but before other things, we're still little rodent-like creatures, kind of weaselly actually at the time. I had an ectopic pregnancy, which is one of those things where the embryo's in the wrong spot, for those who are listening who don't know.
Was
it was
this
in a fallopian tube instead of in the uterus.
So this was a fallopian tube?
This was a fallopian tube ectopic pregnancy. Okay. It lodged in the wrong spot, which is always life-threatening. Right. And you usually know you've got it when something breaks and you have a lot of internal bleeding and you end up on a floor. So I was in a hospital a couple of times. Anyway, but while I'm working on the womb chapter, the evolution of the things that would produce such a problem, this is what happens to me. And then later, after I've given birth to a live baby and I'm breastfeeding, I end up getting mastitis a couple of times, like twice, while I'm working on the breast chapter. And I'm like, well, I should never write the menopause chapter, clearly, because the menopause chapter is actually all about death. So I might just die writing the menopause chapter. And I kind of superstitiously put it off until later. In the end, thankfully, as you can see, I've survived, nor have I entered menopause prematurely, to my knowledge. So it all worked out, but it's true. There's this weird process, and it took me about 10 years, top to bottom, to research and write the book, which is not a small amount of time.
Big investment.
Single project. Now, at the same time, to be fair, I was finishing my experiments and writing up my dissertation for the PhD at Columbia, which is an unrelated.
And what was the dissertation, by the way? What was it on?
So the dissertation was a series of experiments. I wrote a bunch of computer programs to analyze thousands and thousands of novels and narrative nonfiction texts in order to see if I could learn things about how narrative helps us remember stuff. Why does we know that story is a mnemonic, that story helps us remember things better than, say, presenting information in a list. Any psychologist could tell you that. But we don't actually have good models for why. And I saw an opportunity to do something computationally. So I wrote a bunch of computer programs and I did that. My committee is very interdisciplinary. My committee was split between the literature department at Columbia and the cognitive psychology department. And I had mentors over in neuroscience and in comp sci, and I was just a little freak ball. They gave me all the rope to hang myself, which I did repeatedly.
Can I ask you, when in the process of writing this book, because it took 10 years, I'll ask you another question that sets this up. How old are I think you have 2 children now.
Yep.
At this time.
3 and 5. Right
3
now,
and 5.
3 and 5.
And then the ectopic pregnancy was before the first or between the 2?
Oh, way before. The ectopic pregnancy was towards the very beginning of the book. Yeah.
So basically, these kids were born during the process of the latter half of this book, by which time you had the book done and were in various drafts, or when did they emerge?
I had a manuscript done. I didn't write it front to back. I wrote it, sort of chapter by chapter once I had the whole manuscript done, and there was a lot of deep revisions to do. Yeah. But it was true that the process of giving birth to my own children really helped solidify a theory that I'd already found and been working through in the scientific literature, which is that we're really bad at making babies, just as a species. We're just this is just flaming garbage. This is a terrible, terrible situation that we have. And we forget that it is, of course,
laying eggs in your own body, you didn't read the fine print.
Yeah, terribly sorry, but this is actually not a great situation. And remember, of course, that just because something is normal does not mean that it's fine.
Yeah, yes, normal maybe not the word. Happens all the time, but maybe not normal. Maybe normal in another million years when it's all worked out.
It's fascinating. It was fascinating for me to learn how, the sort of rosiest image of a human pregnancy and birth and recovery, postpartum period, is actually the rare case.
Well, you talk about that in your book as well.
I do. Yeah, absolutely. Compared to other primates, okay, our pregnancies are longer. For an animal our size, a primate of our size. Our pregnancies are longer and harder and more prone to crippling, dangerous, sometimes deadly complications than they are for almost any other primate, except a squirrel monkey. She also has problems, and we're sad for her. But the majority of primates, no, it's not like this at all. The majority of other mammals, many have problems, but the vast majority, no. Don't look into the hyena. She has a problem. You can look online, and I'm not going to tell you right now it's painful. We're sad for her. But yeah, generally speaking, we're among the worst case of
Mm-hmm.
mammals and how we make our babies. And it's not a thing that's not a story we usually tell about human womanhood. You know what I mean? It's a story you
Mm-hmm.
only get if you actually know biology and look out at other living
Right.
mammals and actually look out at our evolutionary past and say, where did this come from? What's going on? Because in our usual stories about humanity, this is the fulfillment of a destiny,
Right.
that this is made maybe slightly painful, some sin or something, depends on your religious tradition, but
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, it's bad, but whatever, it's bad for everyone, but then you get a baby, miracle, yay for you, now you've fulfilled your
Mm-hmm.
destiny or something. It's actually, from a scientific perspective, this is really the worst. Actually, the Edenic story of women being punished for something kind of lines up a little bit, except there was but where nobody's punishing us. It's just the
Yeah,
unfortunate
it comes closer to the
evolutionary path.
evolutionary truth than our romanticizing of this of the process.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of the book, related, I guess, to your writing process, two things. And because I forget stuff, I'm being 71, I have an excuse. I've always forgotten stuff, but now I'm 71, I have an excuse. I can say, "Oh, I'm old." Not and my Ernie, my producer, does not buy that. He knows that I'm just being lazy. But let's pretend I need you to remind me of these two questions. One is, in writing the book, and having children in the process of writing the book, did that change anything in terms of actually causing revisions because of personal experience, or heightened something you wanted to look at? And then secondly, and this is a more complicated question, but I have to assure you, you are not only amongst friends, but being interviewed by a fan. So there's nothing loaded about this. As a writer, for instance, right now being old, male, white, in the context of a literary business where a movie comes out called American Fiction that details the kind of hypocrisy of the establishment. I've been around a long time. My first books were published by Penguin, and I've had novels that have been things and so forth and so on. But I've seen an arc. And one thing that distresses me as a writer is that I don't consider myself part of the culture war when I write. I consider myself first a writer, but the culture war topics impact. And writing a book about women is one that naturally fits in people's minds, not in mine. And when I read it, I didn't find the book be part of this. But it's always like, oh, well, this must be something to do with feminism or the women's thing or something. What's the angle? And of course, your angle is science, and you've got a third of the book is footnotes. But I'm wondering if in the editorial process, pitching this, your agent, sensitivity readers, whatever it may be, did you have any battles and or things that you had to give thought to in terms of, wait a minute, what's the context in which this is coming out? Not so much just as a book, but in the wider panorama of the way things are received, in the same way that, because of my evangelical background, Rachel Maddow called me a lot and had me comment on evangelical things because that was my background. You're going to be called on to comment on, quote, women's things that may or may not have anything to do with your book. But how do you escape that? You're a woman writer writing about women at a time when abortion is no longer legal in America. It's fraught. We're fighting politics on these issues. Women are having rights taken away. It's not like you're writing a book into a vacuum. That was much too long of a question, but I'm trying to be clear. And I'm wondering how you place yourself in that, if at all, or maybe you don't want to go there.
It is not possible to escape the very obvious fact that I
Yeah,
am a queer woman sciencing in public
right.
right now in this world in which you and I are living,
Yeah.
in this media landscape in which you and I are reluctantly but sometimes joyfully participating, in this world in which one might speak with a
Mhm.
microphone as opposed to just speaking to a friend. It's a
Yeah.
very obvious thing. There's no
Mhm.
escaping it. There's no dodging it. And I don't know that I necessarily would want to. I came out of the closet when I was 15 in the mid 90s in Indianapolis, Indiana, where my dad had his lab then. He moved his lab around a bunch. He was a cognitive psychologist. I was a subject long before I was a researcher, and I've had a lot of therapy, and I'm fine now. Sort of. I'm fine enough, you know. But that's where I was, and And it was a very different thing to come out in the 90s there than
Sure.
to come out in the 90s on the coasts. It wasn't, it was the idea that we have to save each other because no one else is going to save us was very much beat into me from the start of my adulthood, and so that means that I always feel that deep urgency to never waste a mic. But that also means, and writing a book is its own mic, of course, and all the mics that follow. It is also true that I have been asked many, many times on camera, literally on camera, under the lights, to essentially solve sexism in like 30 seconds. And I usually make a joke about it because that's what I do. I make a lot of jokes, but it's kind of like, I'll do what I can, gentlemen.
Apropos of which, by the way, you have a whole section on the book where the sort of misogyny comes into the evolutionary process itself, and you try to explain why this is so. And it's some of the brilliant passages of the book, by the way, and you're not looking at it as a political issue, but as an evolutionary issue of body type, brain type, timing. I thought, by the way, that was a brilliant section of the book, like
the last chapter. I'm glad you liked it.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much. I'm flattered. I think there is no way to not be political. We pretend that there is, there are people who say the political is personal and there are all these weighted ideas around that. But to politic in many ways is to simply be alive and in public. And we're a very social species. Yeah. So it is absolutely not the case that I'm not political, but it is true that I took a very hard look at the existing science, which took a long time to do in a lot of different disciplines. And I did my very best to lay out the state of knowledge as it is and where it seems to be going, and my assessment of the ideas to the best of my ability, and always checking in with working scientists in those fields when I felt like I wasn't understanding what I was seeing. You'll notice I don't do a lot of physics in this book because my math is good. I was a mathlete, but I'm not really I always say if I don't really understand the paper fully, then I need to, pull that from someone who knows better, so I'm comfortable in many spaces in biology, obviously, but not in physics.
I was also going to ask you about having children during the process, if that led to any revision and or just in terms of your own personal journey. I'm not saying changed your mind about anything. That's not what I'm looking for. But it obviously impacts you, and it impacted the process because you've written a whole book about Eve's procreating and having children.
Maybe I can give you an answer that answers both of your very good but very meaty questions. One, whether or not the process changed me, my relationship to my body, or that, having had these personal physical experiences and social experiences during the process of writing the book, if that revised it. And then also how that does or doesn't play into my politics. Well, I can tell you that my least favorite chapter to write was the brain chapter. For all of the reasons that anyone might imagine that a person like me might not want to write such a chapter. Would you like to write a chapter as a, woman, researcher, scientist, author, person doing this in public about whether or not there are innate differences between male and female brains and whether or not there are any advantages to either? No, I don't want any part of that at all, because that means you're immediately in the history of eugenics.
Yeah.
You're immediately in the middle of the most misogynistic space you can imagine, and very much coming up all the time in public these days, particularly in ways that often pull on pseudoscience to support very bad arguments, and sometimes pull on real science, but then that is misinterpreted, and that I would then, because again, I was forcing myself to remain vulnerable, right? Remember when I said that? Like I have to be open to seeing stuff I don't like. Whether it's about myself or whether it's about topics, whether it's about positions that I don't agree with, that I need to have that responsibility to the ideas and to my readers to say, I have read this and here is my assessment. So to write the brain chapter, oh God, that meant that I had to say, I had to dig into what science is actually there about whether or not men are smarter than women. what does smart even mean? And I had to go through all of that, and whether or not women are more emotional, whether or not we're more fragile in some way. I had to go through all of that.
Sure.
So that meant that actually the brain chapter I kept dropping and coming back to. It took me the longest to finish of all of them, because I would just
also you were treading on a lot of kind of toes there, because, it's like, oh, what was this comedian's line the other day I saw that, no sentence that begins with the word "the Jews" ever ends well. Like there's something you don't want as a comedian. It's like you don't start saying "the Jews." Well, in the same way, it's like the female brain. Good luck.
I know.
I'm
It's like,
not
oh
going
my
there.
God. It was just right. And just and then of course, friends who are, trans and non-binary, and just the whole goddamn
Well, not
thing.
to mention the 1970s and 80s feminists who I personally know, because I'm from that era. And I don't mean anything bad, but you can deal with this as you want, but seem to be afraid of the hard sciences, as in we don't want to know if there are any real differences, because we have a political view of the sameness of gender and men and women not being differentiated. Don't talk to us about this subject. Not that it was my subject, but there was a moment in the evolution of American feminism coming out of the 60s and 70s and early 80s, which was not friendly to the hard sciences if the hard sciences question the social assumptions. And I think one of the refreshing things about your book is that you did go there, and you gave us a third of your book in footnotes to back it up. I think the chapter on the brain is great. I'm just curious whether you had reactions, from people who would be, say, not from the right or from a misogynist point of view, but from women who were bothered by the fact that there's real stuff in your book about real differences. You don't say there are no differences.
I don't say there are no differences. It's just that the differences that are there are either such small effect sizes. That's in the sciences. That means that, it's statistically significant. In other words, there is a difference, but the difference is really small, really, really, really small. We're just like a hair's breadth of signal in the data for the most part. And that's a really important thing that doesn't often get talked about in public. Like when we talk about differences, what are we really talking about? We're talking about and that it's not reliable, So for example, there are some structural differences in the brain. Remember, the brain isn't just one thing. It's actually a bunch of different regions kind of glommed on to this kind of football shaped thing with a ridge down the middle. And so it's actually, and many of these brain regions evolve at different points in time. So actually, this is a complicated mess up here in your skull. But one of the interesting things is that, statistically true, small differences, but there's small differences in ratios of gray to white matter. That's actually how much cholesterol, how much myelination, in one region in the brain, often in people who have two X chromosomes. Okay. But then in the same damn brain, you can have another region that doesn't show that same sex differentiated pattern that in other people with two X chromosomes, you did find it, which is to say, one of the best models I've seen out there is a kind of sex mosaicism, which is to say, some parts of any given brain seem to be more female typical. Some parts of any given brain seem to be more male typical. But what does that produce? Actually, what's interesting is that in the human animal, more so than many other species, you get between the sexes a sameness in functionality. We actually, in other words, seem to be evolving towards a kind of unity of what we can use this thing for, as opposed to a strong sex differentiation of how these things work between the two. But think about the human side of it, which is to say the day-to-day impact. Why does this matter? Not simply to tell the story about whether or not a female brain's going to be better at math or this, that, or the other. And again, by the way, as I say at length in the book, there isn't a lot of evidence that female brains are less good at math. Also, math is a lot of things. There's a teeny tiny bit of math, which is spatial logic, that males have a slight advantage in, but it's not in accuracy. It's in speed, actually. That's slightly faster at imagining an object in your head and rotating it, which is the thing you do in math and geometry, for example. Male typical brains, very slightly faster, but not more accurate if both are given enough time. Anyway, so the really interesting thing about it producing sameness is that it can confuse us in psychiatric spaces. What do I mean by that? There's this huge umbrella diagnosis called major depressive disorder, MDD. You and I might just call that depression, right? But I mean clinical depression. Okay. It is absolutely the case that many pharmaceutical therapies that are used for major depressive disorders will end up producing some sex differences in effect. Okay. And we don't really have good models for why that is. I can tell you that the most common class of drugs prescribed for people with depression is SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. They boost the level of available serotonin in your synapses, if you want to be technical. And for some people, it helps you feel less depressed. Awesome. But what they might not tell you is that one of the most prevalent estrogens, estradiol, is tightly bound in female bodies to serotonin. When you have more estradiol, your body is actually making more serotonin available. And when your estradiol goes down, okay, likewise. This is actually part of why so many women of reproductive age tend to have more depressive disorder, more depressive stuff going on around their periods, because you're getting that hormone fluctuation. Likewise, around menopause and post-menopause, there are unique kinds of depression that fall under that major umbrella of that diagnosis, but may be more tied to fluctuating hormones, right? And so if you have a body that already has a variable amount of serotonin and you take on a drug that's, influencing how serotonin is being utilized in your body, but you don't take into account the fact that this is a body that has estradiol going up and down, you may end up having different effects for that drug, right? But we don't tend to talk about that. Well, outside of psychiatrists who are wrapping their heads around it.
Hasn't been researched enough that you allude to at the beginning of the book as one of the reasons you're writing it. I mean, people have not looked into these differences.
They're starting to. My book wouldn't exist without it. But
yes,
a lot
I know.
Of it's
but
really
what I'm
new
saying
science
is
the
you're
thing.
trying to also fill a gap and call people to a better level of research.
Exactly.
This.
Exactly.
Let me reintroduce you a second here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Cat Bohannon. This is her book. It's the first book in my book club. When I say my book club, I really mean, what do I mean? Yeah, my book club. And it is Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Evolution. I gave away 5 hardback copies this Christmas. This was not a usual thing for me. I don't.
I'm so glad I could solve Christmas for you. I've heard a lot of those stories.
You did. And Kat has written just an absolutely phenomenal book. Kat, one thing I want to ask you about in a minute, but first I want to do something else, is that you've written a book very much for every reader. I'm not a scientist. I loved it. It was a page turner. It's fantastic. And I learned so much. And I told you before, it was like reading a map of my favorite person, which is my wife, Jeannie, and really deepened my understanding of my love for her in terms of just everything that's gone into everything she's done, which I understand better now than ever because of your writing. It really means something to me. I want to ask you about the balance of the footnote section, which I think is like a third of the book. For the general population, are you out to prove something? Are you just an academic, so you always are used to substantiating stuff? But the length of the footnote section, while being very impressive, just curious, because the book itself doesn't come over as a hugely footnotey book.
Well, I put a lot of jokes in there. So for your readers, who want to dive in, it's a lot of it's citational work in that last third, but there's jokes too. Now, part of it is that there were footnotes and then there were endnotes. So footnotes, bottom of the page, endnotes is that back matter, that last third, which is the bibliography and endnotes. The bibliography and endnotes is much more of that citational work. Where did this idea come from? What are some of the major voices in the research space who are talking about this? What are some things you might want to know if you want to dive deeper, right? So that last third is like a quick guide, and it's not even all of my sources, not even remotely, but because Knopf didn't want to publish in volumes. Okay, this is already, you want to fit this on a shelf, Kat. I can always tell you more than what I included, but it's like for those who want to dive deeper, those who want to dig in, not simply academics, but those who really want to know, where did this idea come from?
Where does it all come from? Let me go to one one
Footnotes are a
section.
mixture of
Yeah.
some jokes, some asides, some, a bunch of stuff. But the
No,
reason
no,
to do it,
but people have don't. I'm basically just telling my readers, don't be frightened by that section because
oh
it's
yeah,
one of the most readable and most wonderful books I've read just as a book. Forget the subject; it's wonderful.
thank you.
Let me read a quote from the book that just sort of crosses the line between science and politics in our moment here. Um, but that doesn't mean our Eves weren't doing everything in their power to pursue female reproductive choice. Like other mammals, they were choosy about their partners. And at some point along the evolutionary path, they also started utilizing whatever they could from the plant world's pharmaceuticals in order to control reproduction. And that follows a passage that I kind of alluded to a little bit, not in a jokey way earlier in this interview, where you talk about the differences we see in the genitalia of creatures where there's not so much consent. And I said, well, it was a relief to find out that my ancestors weren't rapey, as you put it, because we have pretty simple penises and vaginas compared to some animal kingdom. Go into a little bit in a non-jokey way this kind of sexual evolution of male and female relations that lead to females protecting themselves by evolving very complex ways of preventing insemination, and then come up to the present tense of our modern Eves. And that is right now in the United States of America, this idea that, we've always had, our Eves have always used things from the plant world and pharmaceuticals to control reproduction. And then before that, that evolution itself has gifted women with, I know this is really backward and strange, choice in the sense that evolution itself has been on the side of the female of the species to protect herself from unwanted impregnation. And I thought that was a very strong thing you put in your book. You didn't put it that way, but there's something really powerful here. Would you go there for me, please?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there's this very potent thing that we do when we talk about the body and what we should do with it. We say, is such a thing natural or is it not? This idea of what is natural. And usually that N word, natural, is so loaded and so attached to our ideas of virtue, what's right and wrong, and what we should be doing, and whether or not what we're doing is new and unnatural, right? And we definitely use that kind of language around female reproductive choice.
Right.
We use that language around abortion. We use that language around C-sections. We use that language around all kinds of what we imagine to be new technology that we use to intervene on women's bodies and how fertile or less fertile that woman might choose to be, which of course has that underlying thread of choice itself is unnatural. That's really a lot of what drives that idea. Not simply that technology would be new, but that somehow in the animal world, female choice is not a thing. Right? And any given biologist, no matter what species they specialize in or what zone, will tell you, oh, no. Female choice is very much a thing and very much drives a lot of the evolution of many different body plans, in fact. Now, there are some obvious places to look for that and some less obvious. One of the most obvious places to look for it is, of course, the genitalia. Because for any species that has a vagina, you have a co-evolving phallus for the most part. And in that, so you have to think of them as co-evolving together, but not simply in collaboration to make more babies or make more eggs or what have you, but also in competition, right? Because we have, of course, now most birds actually don't have a penis. The cock is a misnomer. Right. Chickens don't have a penis at all. They actually kind of line up two holes and kind of do a thing and then kind of put their feathers back down. But ducks, certain species of ducks do have a phallus, and certain species of ducks have very elaborate penises because in part they are prolific rapists. The mallard duck, sorry to ruin ducks for everyone everywhere in suburban spaces in the United States. I know they're very popular in our artificial ponds, but unfortunately the mallard duck, the male, is the drake is a problem. Let's just call him problematic, okay? Because they tend to be rapists, they tend to be gang rapists. It's a whole thing. Sorry, trigger warning. For those of you who've been through horrific things, I apologize. I won't go into detail. But the point is, this has been going on so long. In other words, this is a norm for the species.
Sure, this is what they do.
This is what they do, and they've been doing it for eons.
Mm-hmm.
That the female vaginal structure in the female mallard has evolved countermeasures. Yeah. So she has an elaborate kind of labyrinthine vaginal structure that has, if you like, trapdoors. And so when she is being literally assaulted, again, consent is tricky in animals that are not human. So let's put a big bracket around that. We don't know what to call consent. It can just seem kind of obvious when she does or doesn't want it, given she's trying to get away. Okay. Anyway, so when she doesn't desire this partner in her duck way, whatever that is, she closes off these pockets of her vagina, her vaginal structure that trap the unwanted seminal material, that trap the unwanted sperm. And when he finally, thankfully, leaves, she's able to expel most of the unwanted sperm. Sometimes you'll even catch her kind of pecking down there to kind of get that out, okay? And we know in terms of outcomes that, and direct observation, that when she wants a partner, she unfolds this internal structure and allows a path towards the egg. And she is far more likely, most of her offspring are in fact fathered, not all, but most, by chosen partners. So there are many different species that have this pattern of what a biologist would gently call sexual coercion, and you and I would probably call rape. Okay. And that have elaborate competitive male and female genitalia, right? Where the female is doing things to reinforce female choice and the male is counteracting that. Again, neither of them are choosing to evolve these bodies. This is just pressure of evolution over time, what is rewarding or what isn't, right? So one of those things which you alluded to that I found fascinating in the human body is that no, we don't seem to have anything like that. It is not the case, for example, that people who have been raped are more likely to be pregnant or less likely to be pregnant than in a normal married couple. Actually, we have the same fairly lousy fertility rates as a species in any given sexual scenario. And indeed, if we had a long history of that violent sexual coercion, like the duck, I mean, to the point where it's just like, that's something our species does.
Sure.
You know, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It happens a lot and it's horrible and all of it needs to stop. And all of it historically needs to stop. But it's not the case that it was so much a thing that was present along our evolutionary path that we've produced those kinds of physiological traits that would betray such a past.
Yeah, and in a weird way, that's sort of encouraging in terms of our future, in an odd sense of that, like, you know, this, speaking of normal and not normal, you know, the norm for human reproduction, thankfully, has not been so rapey that we had defensive vaginas, if you could put it that way. Let me
among many other traits, exactly.
Yeah, let me go to a related subject that I also found very enlightening in your book and wonderfully put. You know, there's this apocryphal thing about Margaret Mead, I think, who said the beginning of civilization was a healed femur. And then you go on and say, no, it was the invention of basically obstetrics and gynecology when the first female at some level of our evolution squatted down and helped another female deliver. And that essentially, I want you to talk a little bit about the, I guess, gynecology as an evolutionary step, but also just, you know, this is actually the most important thing that's ever happened, because you and me are talking and we wouldn't be here because birth in our string of primates is very messy and very difficult. All our females would have long since perished, and this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for that. Talk a little bit about that before we close this out, because I just thought that was a wonderful thread in your book that I followed through with great eagerness and interest. You know, having watched 3 of my own kids born and grateful for the intervention that saved Jeannie's life with one of the pregnancies and so forth. Talk to me a little bit about this whole gynecology thread.
So it is absolutely great. Margaret Mead is not wrong in thinking that one of the distinctive things about our species is how we help each other. Right? That vulnerable members of our group are often taken care of. Now, given the vast injustice in the world, unfortunately, we are not perfect at this. Okay. Actually, we need to do much, much better for one another in every way one can imagine. However, it is true that there is a thing that's very distinctive about us, wherein we do have that urge and we do tend to care for vulnerable members in our group. Right. So that's why she's lodging on to the broken femur, because actually in the ancient world, a broken leg, oh my goodness, if you're bipedal, Oh, that's a whole thing,
Sure.
right? Very, very likely to die without help. So there have been some absolutely fantastic women scientists and others who have paid attention to how vulnerable our offspring are. I just want to flag Sarah Blafford Hrdy, who did this amazing book called Mothers and Others, who says that actually helping one another with our vulnerable children is
Sure.
the moment that we really launch our success story, that we become interdependent, that we create these complex societies, that, you know, it's not just the femurs, but it's the babies, says Sarah Hrdy, right? And so I saw that that space was done, but the thing that I didn't see a lot of attention to was how vulnerable our pregnant people are,
Yeah.
and the people who have given birth and the people who are postpartum. Because in many, many ways, our species is always born to kind of a broken mother. Okay. Not to say that we don't have incredible strength in female bodies. We're incredibly strong. We're incredibly good at this. And because of our gynecology, we are incredibly supported throughout this dangerous and difficult process. And most of us will have healthy pregnancies who do have them and move on. But when you think about our ancestral state, and you think about how inherently dangerous are not simply the moment of birth, but actually our very long pregnancies with our invasive placentas, so many things can go wrong, right? And I say, oh, well, actually, then this as a species is clearly our most important problem to solve, right? It's not simply the femurs. Most of us are not necessarily going to break a femur, but if half the damn species is very likely to become pregnant and then be made extra vulnerable because of that process in ways that other primates much less so, oh, then no. That's the most important thing we needed to solve. And so one of the most important moments then in our evolutionary lineage is the moment we started having midwives.
Yeah.
Okay. And most think that we started doing that well before we had anything like language, when we were still rather furry, in fact. Most think it was like Lucy, the Australopithecine, 3.2 million years ago. She also had a narrow pelvic opening and large babies, which at the very least makes the birth process more difficult. But really the bigger deal, which is harder to tell, is where our placentas got really, really invasive, which meant that we had bigger risks of bleeding and immune problems and other things that come with the way that we make babies the way that we do. So no, actually for me, the most indicative thing that says, here is where we started becoming more human, is that moment, that exact moment when a female is giving birth and someone else who's probably another female is helping her. That's the point in time. Absolutely.
Yeah,
and the thing is that surviving that isn't simply helping us make more babies. Sometimes it's also helping one another have fewer babies, actually.
Yeah, and also helping with the long process of raising a human child that's not like other mammals that's up and scampering around and eating grass, 2 hours later.
Very much so.
And so forth and so on. A couple things before I wrap up. I just first of all want to say that I have been talking with Cat Bohannon about her book, Eve, how the female body drove 200 million years of evolution. And it's this book. And I love this book very much. And it will be the first in my book club that's upcoming. It has to be read. And this is my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And I have on Substack, I do a commentary, also called it It Has to Be Said. Two last questions from someone who asked, she was wondering, this comes from Ernie, but someone who's been watching texted him. I'm wondering what advice you have for new mothers based on the research of your book. Anything you want them to know? And another one also, are some birthing procedures more traumatic to the child than others? I guess both of those keying off what you were just talking about.
I'll do one thing to speak to both of them. First, it is very unlikely that anything that you are doing is wrong, you new mothers. We have this very self-punishing thing. And of course, we live in a society that very much wants to tell women not only what to do, but that whatever they're doing is definitely wrong and should do this other thing, right? And it's actually more true that having babies is So very, very difficult, no matter how well everything has gone. And that the vast majority of mothers are, yes, instinctively doing the very, very best that they can to raise that new child in whatever circumstance in which that child's arrived in the world.
Yeah.
That whatever you are doing to support the health of your child and your own health, so long as you're developing good relationships with your doctors, and so long as you are doing whatever you can, given that useful and actually medically sound advice, is probably just fine. So try to punish yourself less,
That question
and you
came
and your
from,
child will both be happier.
yeah, it
As
came
for
from a,
type, go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, go ahead. I was just saying that question came from somebody who made a wonderful movie called Year One about postpartum depression, Aaron Bagwell, who's a friend of this show.
Yes, and
Sorry.
PPD has finally been getting so much more attention,
Yeah.
and I'm so grateful for that. And frankly, it's still not enough. So anyone working to call attention to postpartum depression, postpartum dementia, and other mental health issues for new mothers is doing good goddamn work in the world. So please do more of that, and all of my gratefulness to that
Yeah.
person.
I interrupted you.
No, 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 no. It's fine. It's fine. No, thank you for calling attention to her work. That's wonderful. I did suffer from postpartum depression myself, and thankfully had a very good relationship with my therapist and was able to recover. But many women are still suffering in silence, and that is a thing. The other thing I would say in terms of the safety of one method of birth or another, it's tricky. I think that there have been good and bad things about the home birth movement in the United States. The good thing about it is that we're talking more about birth in public, and we're valuing the experience of people who give birth in ways that we haven't previously, right? Because we do this thing where we value the baby and forget about the mom.
Sure.
Right. And that's that thing that I really, I'm concerned about. And for example, even in the home birth movement, and here's a less great thing, there's still so much talk about what's best for the baby and do it for the baby. And aren't you doing enough for the baby, and shouldn't you do more? And why aren't you just enduring pain because for the baby, right? In other words, there's even in that movement this emphasis on decentering the birthing body and still making the priority whatever happens to the potential kid. And I would really like to recenter the person who's giving birth a bit more. And I would also like to offer simply that there's nothing virtuous about pain. Okay. No one is a better person for enduring pain or a worse person for choosing to not endure pain. That doesn't have anything to do with how good a person you are. There are very, very safe and awesome medications available, epidurals and non-epidurals in medical settings, that can help you go through this innately painful process that is human labor, which will not in any way decrease the safety of your offspring. Okay. Here's the thing that people talk about. People talk about with epidurals that it's going to lengthen your labor. And this becomes a big thing. And it's like it increases the rate of this and that. There's a fear, in other words, of outcomes for mother and child. I would like to tell you that no one maybe is telling you that the length of time your labor is lengthened is between, I think it's like 10 to 14 minutes on average. Just putting that out there. Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, there is a very small boost in the time in which you might be in labor, but it is not hours and hours. And it's very unlikely to be the thing that's driving any additional complications there. So I would offer that too.
Thank you, Erin, for the question.
And thank you for the question.
One last little thing to conclude on. First of all, just say again how much I love the book, and Eve is a fantastic book, and Kat's done an amazing job. And Kat, one of my emotions in reading this was the same thing that happens to me when I watch great art, ballet or opera. My grandchildren always ask me why I'm tearing up, and of course the music moves me. But I tell them why I'm really tearing up is I know enough about life to understand the commitment of that dancer to produce this moment. That's why I cry at great art. And I got to tell you, I teared up reading your book because I felt that 10 years of work in there. It's a fantastic book. So I didn't want to leave without telling you that your book moved me just on the basis of what went into it. It's a real work of love, and I love the book.
Thank you, Frank.
I just think it's a real gift. It's really a gift that you've given to your readers. So So thank you. And that's all I have for this go round. I hope we talk again. We're going to do a book club, and I hope we get a good response from it. I heard about this book because someone's making a movie about my life for reasons unknown, but they are. And the producer director sent me a thing saying, hey, whatever else you do, read this book called Eve that she had
Oh my
stumbled
goodness.
across. So yeah, Laura, the producer, put me on to this. And then somehow she got in touch with you, I think. I'm
She
not
did.
sure. And then she said, do you know about this? And I said, I don't know about this yet. So that's all word of mouth.
That's
So thank you.
beautiful. I love
Yeah.
that.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Kat. Anything you want to add to this before we go? Something that I didn't ask you that you should say, or anything? We're not limited by time here, but if there's something you want to add, please do.
Well, I want to say thank you for listening and thank you for watching. I would also, though, want to say every single person who is watching and listening right now to this video is already the best authority in the world on what it's like to live in his, her, or their body. No one knows better than you what it's been like to be you, to live in this crazy mammalian body that you've got with one set of features or another. What this book offers, what Eve can do then, is just give you some new stories for where that body came from, some new language to use to describe those experiences, some new points of reflection, some new things to debate with your friends and argue about, some new things to talk about with your wife if you've got one. But it doesn't ever say, no, you are not the authority. It's more to say, here are some more things that you can use to understand the authority that you've already got.
Yeah, and that's very much the tone of the book. And I love the way you love your little creatures all through the book.
I do.
You write about our little forebears, even if they're millions of years ago, with such personal affection. I loved all our little Eves as we met them through the book. So again, many, many, many thanks, Eve. I mean, Eve. See, I did it, Ernie. I called her Eve.
You did do it. Oh, they should leave that in though, because that was great.
I knew I would do it. Ernie said you're going to call her Eve all through the show. Okay, Kat.
Yeah.
And by the way, I like your page where your picture on your own page is you sticking your tongue out and holding a skull. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's a replication of a Homo habilis skull.
Yeah,
So that's
well, they should have put that on the book
chapter.
Your author picture on the back is more serious Knopf style, but I like the one on your website. And we will put all your stuff. Everyone will be able to buy your book and go to your website and do all those good things. So thank you so much, Kat. This has been a real treat.
Thank you.